Nepotism actually can work against you, and Shedeur Sanders' situation at the NFL draft this year really proves that. Let's break down exactly what happened with Shedeur and why he fell so far in the NFL draft, and whether or not this is actually about his dad, his talent, or his actual personality. If you're new to football or you just don't follow the draft or college football, the NFL draft took place this weekend, and while we saw a ton of kids' dreams come true, one of the biggest stories that came out of the NFL draft was Shedeur Sanders' continual fall from the expected draft position. Shedeur Sanders is a quarterback who played for Colorado University. He's also the son of Hall of Famer Deion Sanders, who was in fact his coach, and we will get into that a little bit. But going into the draft, the majority of these mock drafts that we saw from ESPN, from other various sporting sites, projected that Shedeur would definitely go in the first round. Early conversations actually projected him as a first overall potential pick, with things going back and forth between him and Cam Ward, who ultimately did go first overall. But as we got closer to the draft, we also started to see people saying that he probably wouldn't go that high, that there were some issues that teams felt with his attitude and his personality. But even then, we still saw him projected to go at least in the top 21, and at worst case scenario, for sure in the first round. There was also an expectation that the Cleveland Browns were a possible fit for him. And also, if you're not super familiar with the NFL draft, something that is important to know is that there are 7 rounds, in that in total 257 players are drafted. But when you get picked, it does matter for a number of reasons. First and foremost, getting drafted does not actually guarantee you a final roster spot when the season starts. After the draft, everybody reports to rookie camps and then training camp, and NFL teams can have a 90-man roster during their training camp period. But by the time the season starts, that roster has to be cut down to a 53-man roster, meaning that between the draft and the season actually starting, about half of your roster gets cut. So after you're drafted, you still have to prove yourself in training camp to make that final roster and actually step onto the field during the regular season. Obviously, the more you fall in the draft, the later you go, the less expectation teams necessarily have of you making it through. And the other big main thing about how early you get drafted, how much money you're going to make in that first contract that you sign. Which brings us to Shedeur specifically. Shedeur was originally expected to go in that first round. Instead, he wasn't drafted until the 5th round, and he was the 144th overall pick out of, remember, 257, meaning that he wasn't even in the first half of all draft picks. So what does that mean monetarily? If he had gone early in the first round as he was originally expected to do, his contract would have been around the $40 million range. If he had fallen out of the top of that round but still gone in the first round, he would have been looking at something between $13 and $14 million. The second round would have put him in the range between $10 and $6.8 million. Third would have put him around $6 million, but as the 144th pick overall, Track actually estimates that his contract will be around $4.59 million. Now, to put that into perspective, in college for his name, image, and likeness deals, he's estimated to have made about $6.5 million. That means for Shedeur, his pro salary in the NFL is actually going to be less than what he was making in endorsements in college. So how exactly did this happen? There are a couple of factors, but only one of them is really actively being talked about. And we're going to run through it, but I have to tell you, there are a lot of factors outside of his attitude and perception of it. But let's talk about attitude and perception first. Shedeur's dad, Deion Sanders, was known for being flashy and arrogant when he was in the league. And that flash and arrogance is being seen in his son. But the big difference that we're seeing a lot of people highlight is the fact that Shedeur already has the arrogance before even going pro. Deion, by comparison, had a chance to kind of prove his worth in the league before he began doing this. And so we can talk about that arrogance, that flash. One of the biggest things that kind of crystallizes it is the fact that Shedeur was invited by the NFL to the draft. Not every player is invited to be in the green room during the draft. And when you're invited, it's generally because they expect you to go early on when they're still televising and making a big deal out of the draft. As the rounds fall, it's still televised, but they're not showing the green room anymore, and usually the players are not actually there to walk out and put their hat on and hug the person that's announcing. Additionally, as you fall down the rounds, you also see the names that are announcing those draft picks become less recognizable, and by the 4th and 5th round, we were seeing fans even teleconferenced in to announce the draft picks. So being invited is usually a good sign and an honor, but instead of accepting that and actually being in the green room with the other picks as the draft was going on, Shedeur declined his invitation and instead hosted his own watch party. That watch party was not only incredibly lavish, but very much the watch party of someone who expects that they're going very high in the draft. Shedeur had disco ball dancers, a custom shelf built with every single team's hat that he might get drafted by, and a custom built backdrop that had a sofa in front of it that he was expecting to do his interview in after he had been drafted. His catchphrase "Legendary" was everywhere as well, and his logo, which is a $sign squared, was not only on jewelry but also embossed on a custom jacket. And there are a lot of things that can be said about whether this is bad or whether this is good, whether it's too flashy, whether it's too arrogant, but there are two things that are true. One, it is a snub to the league to actually turn down the invitation to be in the green room. And two, Shedeur very clearly expected himself to go high overall. But if we're being completely honest, arrogance and bad attitude and flashiness, all of that is not enough to make the entirety of the NFL uninterested in someone. That is, if they are very talented. So the question is, aside from personality, aside from Deion Sanders, aside from this perceived expectation that Deion would try to involve himself on whatever team his son was on, what are the factors that could be making NFL teams question Shedeur's talent? Because maybe first overall wasn't on the table ever, and maybe arrogance does make you fall out of the first round. But falling all the way down to the 5th round and being drafted by a team that not only already had 3 quarterbacks available, but had drafted a 4th before him, that points to some questions about talent overall. But when you look at the pre-draft conversation, his numbers looked like he did deserve that earlier draft pick. He has a very high completion rate, and with the help of another star, Travis Hunter, as well as his father as the coach, they've really turned Colorado into a much stronger program in just 2 years. So aside from personality, let's run through a couple of the things that are being talked about from reporting, as well as anonymous comments by coaches. One really big thing that we're hearing is that teams were questioning his athleticism, and that's shown in the fact that he took a number of unnecessary sacks. He wasn't able to move quickly enough to avoid them, and he wasn't making plays quickly enough either. And that athleticism issue is not only a problem for him as a quarterback, but also a problem for teams that might have wanted him to move into a different position. One thing that does happen in the transition between college football and the NFL is that you do see players who are drafted from playing a specific position moved into a different position and retraining in that position because that team needs them to do that more. If teams felt that Shedeur was not specifically athletic enough to make that transition, that limits him to only being able to be a quarterback for a team. And if they don't feel that he fits that quarterback role, if they don't feel that he can move enough to avoid sacks, it also means that he's not going to be as competitive against NFL defense as he was against college defense, which also points to whether or not he was actually as competitive in college as we want to believe he was. Colorado had 6 draft prospects this year. Shedeur obviously was one of them, and Travis Hunter is the other big star whose name you've heard. Travis went 2nd overall to the Jaguars, and he also is a Heisman Trophy winner. But when you look at the other draft prospects from this team, 2 of them went in the 6th round, and 2 of them actually ended up as undrafted free agents, meaning that they were not selected in any round of the NFL draft. So when you're looking at whether or not this was a very competitive team, we really only saw one standout from that school, which then brings up a team question of Deion Sanders. When you look at Shedeur's career, Deion has coached him since he was a child. He coached his elementary school teams, his high school teams, and then both of his college teams. And there's something that isn't ignorable about the fact that his dad has been his coach his entire life. There is going to be a question in teams' minds that if your dad is the coach and also has the pull of being a Hall of Famer, how much of your journey has been run by your father? And not just by your father, but by the guy calling the shots. How much of these teams are completely catered to Shedeur? How much of his talent is his dad stacking that talent around him? And again, those parts specifically are actually just what ifs. Those are questions that would be completely valid for these NFL teams to be asking. And then there are other points that would make those questions even bigger, like the fact that at the NFL Combine, Shedeur actually declined to throw. You have to remember that he's a quarterback. He's trying to get drafted as a quarterback, and at the NFL Combine said, I don't want to throw the ball. And then there's the question of what happened in his team meeting, because we have seen a number of anonymous coaches say that their team meeting with him went terribly. And compared to Cam Ward, who did go 1st overall and was seen as Shedeur's kind of biggest competition, they very much enjoyed their meetings with Cam. Cam was likable, humble, and seen as a team leader potentially, and in contrast, Shedeur seemed to have pretty terrible meetings. So when you stack all of that together, I don't think it necessarily all came down to this conversation about his personality, about flash and privilege. I think it actually came down to a question of whether or not teams believed he was actually good enough to be that high of a draft pick. And the question actually becomes, if it weren't for his dad, how far would he have fallen? Would he have been drafted this high? Or does his last name actually bring him up higher than he would have been? Another thing to remember is that his brother, Shedeur Sanders, was also available for the draft and ended up as an undrafted free agent who then signed with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I think there are a lot of different factors that we could look at with this, but I do think we would be remiss not to look at the other factors outside of personality that are being reported. Shedeur wants to be a quarterback. That means he wants to be the leader of a team. He not only wants to be the leader of a team, but a face of the team. And that does mean that you have to have leadership qualities. So I do think that there are questions around the idea of whether or not he would be a good team leader. And it's clear that in his meetings with these teams, he didn't make them believe he would be. But I also think there's this idea of whether or not nepotism is always a good thing. Shedeur's father is Deion Sanders. I know I've said that multiple times in this video, but if you are kind of new to football and you're wondering why this situation happened, it's important to understand that Deion Sanders is a Hall of Fame football player. But in addition to that, while he was playing in the NFL, he was also playing in Major League Baseball. baseball. Deion Sanders was a two-sport athlete at the professional level. He was incredibly athletic and he was actually legendary. And while he was arrogant and a lot to deal with, he also had the talent to back that up. Now, if you look at Shedeur and Shiloh also, you have to remember that teams are looking at this and saying, you've been trained for your entire life by one of the best football players that exists. Does that mean what we're looking at now is the highest level of your potential? Because you've been being trained by someone we know to be one of the greatest football players ever. So do you have a cap? Have you already gotten to the highest amount of your potential? And how much of your dad pulling the strings pads your stats? Do I think Shedeur is an untalented football player? Absolutely not. But do I think his attitude is the only reason he fell so far in the draft? Also no. And I think we've been losing a lot of that nuance in this conversation, because there are questions that would be valid for a team to ask. There is the possibility that his draft expectations were higher than they should have been, and that a lot of those expectations were coming from the fact that his father is who he is. So I don't know exactly why Shedeur fell as far as he did. These are just a couple of the facts that I think we should be looking at holistically to really see what happened here. But there is one important thing to say. Shedeur Sanders getting drafted 144th does not mean that that's the end of his career. It doesn't mean that he has a cap on who he will be in the NFL. Tom Brady, who you probably know is one of the most accomplished quarterbacks in the league's history, actually went 55 picks after Shedeur did. In the 2000 NFL draft, Tom Brady didn't go until the 6th round. He was the 199th pick, and he went on to be one of the greatest players in the league. So if Shedeur actually has the talent, there's nothing saying that he can't prove it, and there's nothing saying he can't have an incredibly fulfilling career in the NFL. The question will just be, can he prove it? Can he show up to training camp and prove to the Cleveland Browns that he's better than the 4 other quarterbacks they already have on the team? That will remain to be seen. We'll have to follow this story as we head into training camp and the final cuts, and as we head into the season itself. But hopefully this helped break down a little bit of the conversation, especially if you're new to football. And if you have any questions about it, please feel free to leave them in the comments and let me know what you think about the situation. Do you think that Shedeur should have gone earlier? Do you think that his talent is overblown? And do you think that his personality was a large factor in this situation? Or do you think that there were real, genuine concerns about whether or not he was talented enough to go in the first round? If you're new to this channel and you like sports that are easily broken down, that's what we do here. So hit that subscribe button for more like this, and I'll see you next time.